So, one of the greatest fears of high achievers, of ambitious and driven people is complacency. I think our fear of complacency, it leads us to do a few things. It leads us first to constantly be looking for more to do. And the reality is there's always more we can do, right? As coaches, there's more practices we can run longer practices. We can spend more time studying the game. We can do more scouting and watching film, more recruiting calls. This fear of complacency also drives us to be looking for how we can be better. And in many ways, it's a good thing, right? After every practicing game as a coach, we easily walk away with a fairly long laundry list of things that we've got to get better at. Now, the area that has the potential to be the most dangerous for us as a coach is to be constantly looking for more wins, more achievement, right? We finished in the top four in our league, and next year we need to win the league. We win the league, and now we have to be constantly looking to win it again. Our fear of complacency in ourselves and in our team, well, it's important. It drives us to be better. But at what stage does it become unhealthy? Like, at what stage are we doing too much scouting, film, recruiting? At what stage does us chasing perfection and more achievement start to hurt performance, enjoyment, and relationships? Well, that's what we're going to unpack in today's episode of the Coaching Culture Podcast. Welcome to the Coaching Culture Podcast, the podcast to help you grow as a leader and build a better culture. My name is JP Nerbun, and I'm joined by my friends and co-hosts Nate Sanderson and Betsy Butterick. In addition to this podcast, I'm the founder of TOC, which supports leaders and their teams to build better team cultures through one-on-one coaching, consulting, online training, and speaking. Learn more about me and TOC at tocculture.com, where you can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter to get the notes to this episode and every episode of our podcast, as well as our top 10 articles and podcast episodes. To learn more about Betsy, go to betsybutterick.com. So today's topic is one that is probably pretty relevant for a lot of coaches that have just kind of finished up their winter sports seasons. At the same time, it's also relevant, I think, for every coach almost every day of the season, when we are struggling with our team and where we might be at, or with a bad practice or a rough game. But definitely one at the end of the season, when we're looking back on things, we are constantly asking this question of, could we have done more? What else could I have done? We're looking towards the future as well. Like, what else can we do here to move the program forward? And I think what it really brings up is this word enough. At the end of the day, there is so much you can do in coaching when it comes to, skill training, development, tactical strategies, watching films, scouting, recruiting. And, you listen to this podcast, you get all these amazing ideas on how to build your culture. And all of a sudden, as a coach, you feel like, how am I ever going to do it all? And you're trying to do it all, but yet it never feels like we're doing enough. And that's kind of the topic today. I know you brought it to us, Nate. Tell us a little bit about how it kind of was really relevant and kind of came up for you recently.
Yeah, JP, I think there's a couple things that have really made me reflect on this question. One of them was just an article that was published by The Athletic a couple of weeks ago, which was kind of a reflective piece over Gino Auriemma's experience this year at UConn, and kind of he lost his mom this year and had some health issues. And it just seemed like he was pushed by circumstances outside of his control into this maybe oddly reflective place for him. And there was a couple quotes in the article that really stood out to me and made me kind of reflect on, our own season and just myself as a coach. And one of the things that he talked about was, of course, UConn had the great stretch a few years back where they won 111 straight games and 4 straight national championships. And, we may never, ever see anything like that again. It's certainly in college basketball. And Gino's reflection on that was like, even when we're going through that, it just didn't feel like it was enough. We were never perfect. There were always problems. There were always things that it just felt like we were teetering on the edge of disaster that nobody else knew about, but the coaches saw was so obvious. And it was like there was still a lingering dissatisfaction that maybe those teams could have been even better than they were, even though they won 111 straight games. And the quote that they put in the article, I'm going to read this because it just spoke to me, was he said, only the painter knows where the smudges are on the painting. If Da Vinci's looking at the Mona Lisa and you're looking at it with him, you're saying, That's the greatest painting there ever was. But in his mind, he's going, and how many places I effed that up and nobody knows about it? In other words, he's looking at the smudges and he's looking at the lines that maybe weren't perfect in his eyes. And it's maybe one of the greatest works of art, in history, right? So I started thinking about our own season a little bit, and we finished up in the Final Four, made the state semifinals this year, and lost on the doorstep of the state championship game. And when you get that close, and this is really true wherever you finish this season, there's sort of lingering regret about, gosh, could we have done more? Could we have done something better? What should we have done? As you said, should we have done more scouting, watch more film, put more time into practice? And for me, I had an exit interview with one of our players just the other day. And at the end of our exit interviews at the end of the season, they always have to ask me a question to get out of the interview. And one of our players said, Coach, how does this year's team compare to the other teams that you've coached in the past? And kind of referring to a couple state title teams that we had a few years back. And it was kind of the first time where I reflected for a minute and realized, like, this is probably the best team I've ever coached. Just in terms of the talent that we had and the culture that we had and the pieces for the system that we were trying to run, and starting thinking about if we were to play one of those state championship teams, like this year's team, even though we didn't win it all, was probably better than any team I've ever coached before. And that really made me start to think differently about evaluating our season a little bit and wondering, like, did I miss something along the way where maybe I should have appreciated this a little bit more? Where now I'm kind of reflecting back and, again, looking at our season like Da Vinci, is looking at the painting where I'm looking at where we could have rebounded better and we turned it over. We still didn't get this fixed. And yet there's a perspective there that maybe is healthier to recognize there's a lot to appreciate here that maybe I missed because I'm driven by this idea that, yeah, but there's more. We didn't do enough. And that just made me sort of think about the way I think about our team and our season.
There's a few things that are great in there. First off, just side note, you have requiring your players to ask a question before they finish in a one-on-one. I think that's great. I think more coaches could use that. I would share my perspective of obviously talking to you almost on a weekly basis in season. There was definitely a sense from you of all the jobs that you had to do and just all the work and all the things that had to be done. And, there might be something to that of not appreciating just, wow, this is one of the best teams, if not the best team I've ever coached. I wonder if other coaches listening are resonating with that. Betsy, in your work with coaches, how do you see this question of enough come up for those coaches?
I mean, how much time do we have for the for the podcast? I see this come up in two main ways. One is personal and one is more performance based in terms of team. So did we do enough? Like in our pursuit of achievement, whether you define that as excellence, you define it as perfection, and I know we can define those differently. Are we as a staff doing enough to prepare our team to have the possibility of that achievement? And then there's the individual. Am I doing enough? Am I enough? Have I put in the time? You mentioned recruiting before, JP, and I see coaches across sport run themselves ragged thinking, well, if I just put in a little bit more time. And even thinking back when I was a young athlete, I think I was at a basketball camp one summer, probably 12 or 13. And somebody said that quote, whatever you're willing to do, the extra effort that you're putting in outside of practice, somebody out there is willing to do one more. And for me, it's like, I almost wish I hadn't heard that, because it's like, like now I have to do one more or two because someone's out there doing one. So if I do two, maybe I'll beat at least that person. So I think in the profession of coaching alone, this pursuit of enough is almost woven into the fabric of our being. And those questions of, am I enough? A coach gets hired for a really big job, and they did a great job presenting themselves and their plan and their philosophy. And now they have the job and they're like, oh my gosh, like, what? Am I enough to take on this role, to fulfill these expectations? And then looking on a daily basis, did we do enough today to move the needle forward? So I think this question of enoughness has both a duality of being a great motivator, that fear of not being enough, while also giving this energetic pull of, what more is possible. And I think the way that coaches wrestle with it is, can we find a balance where it's not just, oh, it's never enough? Because we know that tips the scale in a way that maybe isn't healthy for us as a coach and definitely not for our program. Can we find that balance of pursuing more while also acknowledging what we've done? And what does that look like for each coach?
There's a bit as you go back to some of those messages that you received as a young athlete that I think we're just constantly bombarded with today, that we can always do more, right? That we can always do one more rep. There's someone that's grinding even harder than you. What came up for me there was just like diminishing returns, like just the lack of our awareness that at a certain point, that athlete, at a certain point, that coach is doing things that keep them from being as effective as they could be. And I had recently had a call with a coach just this week earlier, and they took the entire Sunday off. I hadn't done that in months. And the way that she showed up on Monday was just at her best. And she had to delegate. It wasn't done probably to the highest standard of what she would have done it at. But she's like, it was acceptable. It worked. And I was able to show up and be at the best, best I could be for, for my team on Monday. And that's what the team needed at that point. I said, well, what are you going to do moving forward? And it's like, oh, I don't know. I can't keep taking every Sunday off. I can only give half a Sunday at best, and that's where we ended up landing on. But I think it's just a constant struggle to find that balance. It sounds easy in one sense, but it's really, really difficult to find that because one thing I would also say and add to this pursuit and why we're constantly trying to do more and more and more, and we feel like we're never doing enough is because we just don't accept the fact that we don't have as much control as we'd like to think we do. And so I think we're constantly grasping at more control. And there's so much outside of the results, like Gino's success, great coach, right? Maybe the greatest coach in college basketball history ever, right? Someone could argue that. But there's still a lot that just right time, right place, and so many things in that situation have to line up to be able to make that kind of run. And yet we just constantly want to ignore that this fact that we don't have that much control and with outcomes.
We talk about this pursuit of more. And I think about the first time I was in a weight room, first time I'd ever done weight training with club basketball. I was probably 15, and we had to do a set of 10. And I did my 10, and the strength coach was right there, and he's like, do one more. And then I did 11. He's like, do one more. And then I did 12. And he's like, come on, one more. And I failed at 13. But that was a huge transformative moment for me where I realized there's more in me. And I can still see it was in Latin, carved in marble on the desk of one of my dad's bosses when I was young. And it was in Latin, and it said, there's more in you. And so thinking about I love this idea that there's more in us. And my question for both of you is, have you ever had a coach or someone in your life cut you off at a point where you could do more, but they're like, no, that's good for today, or that's enough? Because I think as much as we talk about and pursue that more, it's also important to play with just because we can doesn't mean we should. And so getting into talking about, if we're going to achieve this sense of that's enough, we need to talk about boundaries. We need to talk about, capacity. We need to talk about thresholds, kind of like you were mentioning with the client that you spoke with taking Sunday off. If we're going to achieve enough, then we have to also know kind of where the edges are, separate from what's possible or our capacity, but also where's our optimal point of stoppage so that we don't get those diminishing returns that you mentioned.
So one thing that you've mentioned earlier, Nate, was just something around the idea of fear sometimes being a driver here. And Betsy mentioned a little bit of there earlier too as well. What is that fear about? That fear that so many athletes have and even coaches have that is constantly pushing us towards this mindset of nothing's good enough. I'm not good enough. Where does that come from? What are those fears?
Well, again, I go back to the article, and Gino kind of articulated this when the author who's doing the interview asked him about Gino had mentioned how he tries to leverage his players' fears into motivating their behaviors, right? And driving them as they're chasing national championships or whatever their goals might be. And so the author said, well, Gino, what are your fears? And he said, well, I'm like everybody else. I'm afraid that I'm not good enough, right? And so there's this drive, I think, that pushes us. If you were to peel back the onion and get to really the core of maybe what we're trying to prove or hope that people discover would say about us, is that, yeah, I did do enough for this team. I was good enough for these kids. And I think that that fear of not being enough or perceived as not being good enough really is a driver, right? And I guess my question, and this is what really came out of the article for me, was there's a lot of coaches and players where that motivation has driven them to exceptionally high levels of performance. But is that healthy? Is there a point where that becomes unhealthy, and there's maybe a reflective piece that's missing to balance that out in some way so that we aren't going to the grave, at the end of our career, still wondering, was I enough, or still feeling like it just all that I did, it still wasn't enough. That's my fear as a coach. Whenever I hang it up, is looking back. I don't want to sit on the rocking chair on the front porch thinking I just never got there. I was just never enough. That scares me to death, JP.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. I think there's maybe two questions in there, or maybe guidelines for us there. I mean, one, there's a diminishing returns where it becomes unhealthy. It negatively impacts our performance and holds us back. And like that example of that coach I was mentioning there, I had another call with a business owner, client of mine today, and I was just coaching him through some boundaries in his life and around his schedule. And he would admit, yes, doing these things, taking care of himself, creating time for his family, like those things help him to be at his best. And I said, okay, let's just say theoretically, I agree with you, but let's just say theoretically that that's not true. Let's say that for your business to be more successful, you actually need to give up. If I told you need to actually give up 5, 6 nights a week with your family, and if you did that, you could double profits tomorrow and your business would be thriving. And if you gave up these other things, you would be like, what if that was true? Then what would you really want to do? What would 60-year-old self say to do? He's like, don't do it. Right? Don't do it. Even if it's not negatively affecting his performance, the team, or success, right? When he looks at the grand scheme of things and what's most important in his life, he's willing to say, this is most important. And I'm okay failing at this. I'm willing for my business to fail because I'm not willing to fail at these other things that are most important to me. Now, I don't think he has to make this trade-off. I don't think we all do, but I think there's at certain points where there is moments where maybe there is a point where we could do more, and yet we say, no, but this is what's most important. And so I think there's an element of it's, detrimental to our performance, doing more, but there's also an element of it's actually just against what's our values, right? It's not living authentically true to ourselves and what we truly believe is most important.
And in both of your recent comments, Nate, you mentioned the rocking chair, looking back on your career and what really scares you. JP, you mentioned the client, and when he's 60, what does your 60-year-old self say? And for me, the question of enoughness also involves a question of perspective, right? Because we often talk about, I don't want to look back and think, did I do enough? So the question becomes, okay, how do I bring that criteria for enoughness into the present moment? Like even as a coach, basketball, okay, what does enough look like today? Well, enough looks like if we get through these 3 things and we execute them at this level, even if we're not perfect. And I think about how many coaches, and guilty, right? Okay, last one. Oh, let's do one more. Okay, one more, because we're looking for that point of enoughness. And what's more valuable? Is it more valuable to get the kids out on time because we said practice was going to end at this time, and maybe we don't get the rep that we really wanted to end on, but we've kept that commitment to valuing their time and respecting that boundary? Or are we flexible on that boundary because we need to reach that point of enoughness? So I think rather than waiting for the rocking chair, can we sit on the swing that is like our back and forth, kind of tempo of being a coach right now, and think about what is enough in this context today, whether it's a practice, whether it's with our family, whether it's with, the pursuit of something over the course of a season. Like what is enough in my life right now? How is that showing up? And where does it feel like it's not going to be enough? Those might be the most important areas to focus on. Or where are the areas where it's really challenging for me to feel like anything that I do is currently enough? And then exploring that for a little bit so that we can start to live in our integrity and our authenticity without violating boundaries that we sometimes don't know we've blown through until we're on the rocking chair saying, dang, I missed it there.
Nate, when you look back on this last season and you've been doing this reflection, I'm going to ask you the question that I'm going to ask this client there next week, which is, when did you feel like you made potentially compromises just because of this desire that I had to do more and more and more, and given this trap that it's not good enough, and he's going to reflect on the last week and just, hey, where did he make compromises in his schedule? But is there anything that comes up for you when you look back at areas that you want to be better at and saying, hey, this is enough?
Well, that's an interesting question, JP, because I'd almost think it's the opposite of, well, I'll just give you an example. We have a conversation with our seniors at the start of the year, and we ask them to come up with a senior goal. And those goals are not necessarily related to, I want to score this many points or start. For example, one senior said, I would like to have hot chocolate at one film session this year. Like, okay, so we're talking about fun goals here. Well, Peyton Simpson's senior goal, who was the captain of the captains, was, Coach, we want to get out of practice on time every day this year, every day. And we joke about that at the start of every season. How long is it going to be until we go late? And then how many times are we going to end up going late after that? And she's like, that's what I want. I said, all right, Pate, you got to hold me to that, right? Because there's another side to that. That means you guys got to not waste time in practice so that we can be efficient and we can be done. So I can confidently tell you that at the end of the year, there was maybe 1 or 2 days where we went a couple minutes late, always with permission, because they understood, there's one more thing we had to get to or whatever. And when I look back, I can tell you I have zero regrets about getting out on time and throughout the season. And that's walkthrough, that's film, that's team dinner. When we said, look, you guys are out of here at 7 after we eat, it's practice, it's after the locker room and they want to go talk to their families, like, give me 5 minutes and we're done. And I think that two things resulted from that. I mean, one, players just appreciated it like you wouldn't believe, because then they could schedule around what we were doing. But the other thing that it forced me to do is to be more effective, knowing that, when I think about one of the traps that coaches fall into, for example, is, I know a coach last year that they lose in a regional final. And so the reflection in the offseason is, we've got to do more in the offseason, right? Well, last year we lost in a regional final, and I was tempted to fall into that same reflection of, well, how can we do more? More must be the answer. We've got to give more time, more shots, etc. But when Pate puts the boundaries on me, now it becomes, okay, I only have this amount of time because I've committed to this. How can I be better? How can I teach more efficiently? How can we get out of film a little bit sooner? It forced me to become a better coach. And I think that's kind of what you're alluding to with these boundaries here, is that it isn't just a protection of time with my family and, boundaries for other things in my life. It also has driven me to find better ways of doing what we do. And I am eternally grateful for Peyton putting that boundary on us. And it will be forever known as the Simpson rule, that we're going to be out on time as much as we possibly can going forward.
I love that. And I imagine, finishing on time potentially brings you home earlier, which other people in your life definitely appreciate. I love the idea and what you're talking about there. And I think there's something really to this, which is we just creating some boundaries, and then we give ourselves freedom within those boundaries actually to do whatever it is we want to do and how much ever we want to do. An example of this is recently with a college coach that I was working with on recruitment and their strategy for recruitment. And the coach was just overwhelmed. He's like, oh my gosh, there is just so much that I can do, so much that we can do. We can never do it all. And I don't know how I'll answer the question of, like, what's enough? Like, what have I done enough? And I said, rather than looking at all the things you can do and saying, okay, well, I'll do this and this and this, and I won't do this or that. Start from a place of how much am I willing to give of my life? How much am I willing to give of my staff's life? Of our, if we're working so many hours a week, like we want to work 60 hours a week. Okay, how much of our 60 hours of what we're willing to work are we willing to give to recruitment? So it's creating this boundary of, okay, we're willing to give 15 hours a week towards recruitment on average during these periods, these months. Okay, then what's the best strategy within those boundaries? What can we do that's the best use of our time? And it was amazing, like the little things that this coach came up with, and he had thought about, like, man, there was times where we would spend so much of our staff's work time creating graphics for players, so they could post on social media, so they would feel like really great and to recruit them. And he's like, at the end of the day, actually, I don't know if I really want the player that feels like they need 50 different graphics so they can post to social media that they got an offer or they just accepted an offer, right? Like, do we really want that of a player? And so by creating boundaries, not only forced him to be more efficient with his time moving forward here, but it's actually helping him to be better at what he does, right? And to more effectively recruit the type of players that fit the program. And it really, I think, when we create boundaries, it helps us to really decide what is really important to us, what's most important to us.
And the two things I'm hearing from both of your conversations, and Nate, it started with yours, of the boundary and then also the choice. Like the boundary, the Simpson rule, like, okay, we're going to get on town, but then asking permission, like, okay, do we have permission to go over time so that we can accomplish this? Yes. And that, in working with clients, in working with coaches, and working with athletes, that element of choice is critical to that felt sense of enoughness. And I think even, as a younger me in starting to build my business, knowing that it's never enough. Like as a one-person show, it is never enough. There's always more that you can do, even just in the realm of, let's say, marketing. Like there's so much that needs to be done to be successful in business, knowing perfection is off the table, but let's just go for successful. There's always more I can do. And that overwhelming feeling of, oh my gosh, I'm not doing nearly enough to create the kind of business that I want, the kind of life that I want. I started to get really intentional about one question. And that one question each day was, did I do something that moved my business forward today? And usually the answer was yes. And if that was yes, then that was enough. If the answer was no, I had more questions. The other thing is perspective. And we talked about perspective earlier in the show today. As a coach, when I get to the end of a practice or the end of a season, I can focus on, okay, wasn't enough. What didn't we do? Or what do we still need to do to get better? Or, and sometimes it's I can say, what did we do? What did we accomplish that we're really proud of? And so you mentioned the yin and the yang, Nate, but holding that perspective of, yes, there will always be more we can do. And am I choosing to focus more on what we've yet to do? Or, and sometimes am I also choosing to direct a portion of my attention to what we've done and the body of work we've created, the achievements, big or small, that we've attained, so that I get this felt sense of enoughness while being in pursuit of something more.
I love that. I think that's a really practical way for coaches to approach this question of, like, what is enough, and defining that, knowing that. What are some other things that coaches can be doing here in this to really define what is enough for them and really create those types of boundaries within themselves personally, and then, as you mentioned there, Nate, within even the team?
Well, I think there's just so much power in the question, right, JP? So when I look back at our season this year, that's a question. Did I give enough? Did we do enough? It's a question that we've asked in our exit interviews. When we look at our 9-day lead up to the state tournament, did we do enough and feel like we were prepared? Should we have done more? Did we do too much? Did we feel satisfied with what we put in on the front end, even though it didn't turn out the way that we hoped that it would on the back end? And I think just that reflective piece and creating conversation with our players, it first of all normalizes this idea that we are working with a finite amount of time and resource here. And so did we use that effectively, and could we do it better? It brings the players into that conversation, brings our assistants into that conversation, and also introduces the idea that, it's always going to be a finite resource. right? And so the answer isn't always to do more, but could we have done something better? And I think that's been a healthy line of thinking just for collectively for us as a team and as a staff.
Yeah, I love that. Makes me think about anytime I'm working with someone and they're trying to add a new habit, I'm saying, okay, what are we going to give up? Right. Like we just can't keep adding more and more. And it's the same with the team. A few things that I would also encourage coaches to explore. One is around games or even practices that I have worked with a lot of coaches on implementing, and it's been really helpful. I remember as an athlete finishing a game, and even you play, say, one of your better games, the team wins. My head coach would routinely felt the need to point out areas that we could always be better at. And some might really commend that. But as an athlete, it just got to the point where you're just so frustrated. You got so beat down. You're like, man, nothing I ever do is good enough. Like, we're really going to get hung up with the fact that I turned it over in the third quarter or like this or that moment when the rest of the other 31 minutes of the game, I was pretty darn good, right? Like, it just felt overwhelming and just, I don't think any of us want our players to feel that. I think we want our players to feel like coach believes me and he's pushing me, he's challenging me, but not, well, nothing's ever good enough for coach, right? So one of the cool ways that we do this with teams is we actually, even in practices, we set success criteria. We say, hey, we've been working on this the last week or the last practice. This is what success is for us. It's here offensively, we're going to do this, defensively, we're going to do this. And here's a like team behavior. We typically set 3 of them. And then the team reviews those. And if we've nailed those, right? If we do a good job, like then we just celebrate that. And then the next day we might, break down film and look at areas that we could improve on in other aspects. But success criteria are great for games, are great for practices. They're even a great way to look at a drill. Like if you go and watch one of your practices and you're coaching and there's a drill, like there's no perfection, right? For no team. There's always something you can criticize. But it's sort of like, what are you really trying to get better at? Celebrate that when they do that and then move on. So I think that's even creating boundaries of like, okay, there's 100 different skills. There's 100 different seconds here that I could pinpoint different things that we could do better, but I'm choosing to focus on this. And then I'll celebrate when we get that. So I think that's one really important way.
And that human element, JP, made me think of when we talk about enoughness and going back to one of the questions many coaches find themselves asking is, am I good enough? Right? Or that fear of not being good enough. A question I found helpful in that pursuit, and this came as a gratitude journal prompt. The prompt was, I'm proud of myself for. And I remember the first time I read that prompt, I was like, what? Like I never intentionally thought about like, how did I make myself proud today? It's such a great question, in part because it supports a journey of self-love and acceptance. Like, how am I making myself proud? And the fact that I hadn't considered it before really was eye-opening for me of like, oh yeah, I'm so focused on the ways I need to improve that I rarely think about the ways that I did pretty well today, even if it wasn't perfect, especially if it wasn't perfect, is maybe the most important time to ask that question. So if you're a coach out there wondering if you're good enough, I'm going to invite you to start to reflect on like, how did you make yourself proud today? And you can do this with your team too, regardless of result, separate from what the scoreboard says. How did we make ourselves proud today? What are we proud of? Because if we can start to be intentional about that kind of self-recognition and acknowledgement, it's going to lend itself to a feeling of self-satisfaction, which we know is an important element of enoughness.
I think that's really beautiful. And I think what I would encourage coaches on that reflection, because I know so many people are afraid of, well, if I start taking that approach, I'm going to get complacent. And I think there's plenty of examples of people like yourself and other really good leaders out there that do take time to reflect on what's good while still striving. I mean, it's a both, you're doing both of those things. And that's just, it doesn't mean you have to give up trying to be better and working on yourself. It just means you're creating space to celebrate the good.
Betsy, I love that approach. We did that with our team this year, kind of for the first time, where we started every film session after a game, asking, what are you guys proud of from last night? Both for our JV kids and our varsity kids. And sometimes that could be an individual contribution. And sometimes that was something that we did as a team. And it was after wins and losses. And I just thought it was a great way, one, for them to be seen, right? Because I think especially in girls sports, but also probably true with young men, that it's a little bit taboo in society to play our own trumpet, right? And to be able to verbalize those things. One of the reasons it's so uncomfortable to do in a journal is because we don't do it anywhere else, right? And so I think normalizing that can be really important. And I think you also kind of alluded to, maybe what the existential question here is for coaches that, I think is worth wrestling with, because at some point it's going to wrestle with you, and that question of, when am I enough? And if you're looking for an additional reflective piece to that, I think there's value. This is sort of the process I've been in right now, is looking back at the season and saying, I wish we would have done this. I think we can do this better. This needs some attention next year. Here's maybe some of the things that I regret as a coach, missed opportunities, whatever they might be. And then forcing myself to sit down with the question, but why am I still enough? And that's really hard, and that's really vulnerable, and that maybe takes us to a spiritual place, or a place of faith, or whatever that answer might be. But there's a security when you can find an answer to that question, even in the face of the places you'd like to improve, as JP alluded to there, that I think leads to the healthiest approach for coaches when we're stuck between, I'm chasing perfection, I'm driven by this persistent question of, am I enough? I need to find an answer, to that question for me personally. And the only way to do that is to get in the mud and wrestle with it.
Coaches, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I wish you well on finding contentment on your journey. I hope you know your boundaries. I hope you know your limits of what you and your family is willing to sacrifice in your pursuit to be the best coach you can be and help your team to reach their potential.